Nurses see a hospital as a place of healing. Doctors see it as a battlefield. I look at it and I just see a machine. I worked facilities maintenance for a sprawling 800-bed county hospital in Detroit for 11 years. My job was keeping the machine breathing. I fixed the massive climate control units on the roof. I patched the pressurized steam pipes. I unclogged the pneumatic tube systems. While the medical staff stayed in the bright, sterile hallways, I spent my shifts in the guts of the building. A modern hospital is mostly empty space. For every active patient wing, there are miles of restricted access corridors, sub-basements, and mechanical access shafts that nobody but a guy with a master key ever sees. It is an isolating, echoing environment. The night shift is always a skeleton crew. Around 2 a.m., the overhead PA system clicked on. A monotone voice echoed through the concrete hallways. Code yellow, West Wing, floor 4. Code yellow means a missing patient. Usually it's a dementia case. An older guy wakes up confused, unplugs his monitors, and wanders out of his room looking for a bathroom. Usually security finds them in a stairwell within 10 minutes. 10 minutes passed, then 20. The PA system didn't call an all clear. My radio cracked. It was the head of security, a heavy-set guy named Jerry. He sounded out of breath. "Frank, we got a wanderer." The cameras show him slipping into the old service elevator on the 4th floor. He took it down. "I need you to check the level 2 sub-basement. I don't have enough guys to sweep the tunnels." I grabbed my bulky mag light. The level 2 sub-basement wasn't a place you just wandered into. It connected the active hospital to the decommissioned East Wing, a massive 6-story brick building that had been sealed off for asbestos abatement 5 years ago. The power over there was cut. I took the stairs down into the dark. The heat in the sub-basement hits you like a physical wall. The massive boilers run 24 hours a day, pushing steam through iron pipes overhead. The air smells like wet concrete and industrial grease. It is loud. The mechanical drone of the generators makes it impossible to hear anything beyond 20 feet. I walked down the narrow service tunnel, shining my beam over the heavy pipes. I passed the electrical junction boxes. I passed the old laundry chutes. I reached the sturdy fire doors that separated the active hospital from the dead East Wing. They were chained shut from our side, but the chain was resting on the concrete floor. Someone had taken a pair of bolt cutters and snipped the thick steel links. The cut was clean, fresh metal exposed. A patient with dementia doesn't carry heavy industrial tools in their hospital gown. I pulled my radio off my belt and pressed the transmit button. "Jerry, I'm at the East Wing junction. The chain is cut. I'm going in." I didn't wait for an answer. I pulled the heavy steel door open. The hinges gave a harsh, metallic groan. The East Wing was pitch black. The air was stagnant, dense with dust and the sharp, chemical smell of old cleaning supplies. I swept my light across the worn industrial flooring. About 50 feet down the dark corridor, I saw something resting against the wall. It was a mobile IV stand. The metal pole was bent. The plastic fluid bag was empty, the tubing dragging on the dirty floor. I stepped closer. Lying right next to the base of the stand was a white plastic hospital wristband. I knelt down and picked it up. It had the missing patient's name printed on it, but it hadn't been torn off in a panic. It had been snipped, a perfect, straight cut from a pair of trauma shears. My chest tightened. I stood up. I kept my flashlight beam low to the ground. I followed the drag marks, 2 distinct, parallel streaks in the thick dust on the cracked flooring, leading straight toward the old, abandoned morgue at the end of the hall. I walked very slow. The silence in this part of the building was deafening. The only sound was the rubber soles of my work boots squeaking against the floor. I reached the double doors of the old morgue. The glass viewing windows in the doors were covered up from the inside, taped over with heavy black trash bags. I reached out and placed my hand flat against the wood. I gave it a slow push. The door swung inward. The smell hit me first. Iodine rubbing alcohol and raw meat. It was overpowering. I raised my flashlight. The massive room was supposed to be empty. It wasn't. In the center of the tiled floor, sitting under a battery-powered camping lantern, was a stainless steel autopsy table. The missing patient was lying on the table. He was still wearing his hospital gown. Thick leather restraints were buckled over his wrists and ankles, strapping him to the metal. His eyes were wide open, staring at the ceiling. His chest was rising and falling in slow, shallow rhythms. He was heavily sedated. Next to the table was a rusted metal utility cart. It was covered in medical supplies: packs of gauze, bottles of stolen saline, scalpels, heavy-boned saws. Standing on the other side of the table was a man. He was wearing faded, dirty green scrubs. He had a blue surgical mask pulled up over his nose, but his hands and his face were filthy. He was holding a scalpel over the old man's chest. He didn't look like a doctor. He looked like a scavenger. Someone who had figured out the blind spots of an 800-bed hospital. Someone who realized that if you wear scrubs, put a mask over your face, and walk with a purpose, nobody ever asks for your ID. I didn't yell, I didn't say a word. The man in the scrubs slowly looked up from the table. His eyes locked onto my flashlight beam. They were dead, flat eyes. He didn't look panicked. He just looked annoyed that I had interrupted his work. He set the scalpel down on the metal tray with a soft clink. He took a step around the table, moving toward me in the dark. I dropped the fire door, turned on my heel, and sprinted down the black corridor. I hit the junction doors, bolted into the active sub-basement, and screamed into my radio for Jerry to get every available officer down to the East Wing. It took them a few minutes to get down there with their weapons drawn. I waited by the elevators, my hands shaking so hard I dropped my radio. When they cleared the old morgue, the room was empty. The restraints were unbuckled. The medical cart was tipped over. The fake doctor had vanished into the maze of access tunnels. They found the old man wandering near the old boiler room an hour later. He had a deep, clean incision mark on his lower abdomen, about 3 inches long. The doctors said whoever did it knew exactly where to cut to access the kidney. They just didn't have enough time to finish the job. I handed in my master keys the next morning and got a job maintaining office buildings. Hospitals have too many doors, too many empty rooms. You walk past dozens of people in scrubs every single day. You trust them because of the uniform, but you never really know who is under the mask or what they are planning to do once the hallway is empty. My mother kept her registered nursing license active for 40 years. She trained in the late 70s, a time when medicine was completely analog. If you walk into a clinic today, you see keycard scanners, security cameras on every ceiling tile, and electronic visitor logs. In 1984, none of that existed. A hospital was basically a public building. People wandered in and out. Doctors smoked in the break rooms. Charts were kept on thick paper clipboards. If someone wore a white coat and walked with enough authority, nobody questioned their presence. Mom worked the graveyard shift at General Hospital, an aging, brick-faced facility in downtown Chicago. She was assigned to the palliative care floor. It was a quiet ward. The patients there were simply waiting for the end. She told me this story exactly once and never brought it up again. Most of the night shifts, it was just my mother, one other nurse, and an attendant who mostly stayed downstairs reading magazines. Around 3 a.m., the call light above room number 423 clicked on. Mom was sitting at the nurse's station, charting vitals. She looked down the long, waxed corridor. An amber bulb above the door glowed softly, throwing a muted shadow against the wall. Room 423 belonged to a man named Charlie. He was 80 years old, suffering from end-stage renal failure and completely comatose. He hadn't opened his eyes in 6 days. He physically lacked the motor function to press a plastic call button. Mom assumed it was a short circuit. Old wiring constantly misfired. She picked up her stethoscope, walked down the hall, and pushed the door open. The room was bathed in the weak, blue glow of a street lamp shining through the window blinds. The room was filled with the steady, mechanical hiss of oxygen concentrator. Mom approached the bed to reset the call cord. The cord wasn't resting on the mattress. It had been pulled tight, draped over the metal side rail, and wedged between the mattress and the frame. Someone had intentionally pulled it. She reached down to untangle the wire and brushed the bedsheets with her knuckles. They were damp. The pillowcase was soaked in sweat. He struggled to breathe, his breaths rapid and shallow, his chest moving in spasms. Mom quickly checked his oxygen line. The clear plastic tubing ran from his nasal cannula down to the flow meter on the wall. The dial had been turned down, not completely off, just low enough to slowly starve his lungs, stretching out the suffocation over a long, agonizing hour. She spun the dial back up to 4 liters. Charlie's breathing gradually steadied. She turned around, looking at the empty room. Older hospital layouts featured tall, built-in wooden wardrobes where patients could hang their civilian clothes. The louvered door of the wardrobe in 423 was standing open about an inch. Mom stared at the narrow gap. The ambient light from the corridor spilled across the floor tiles, illuminating the base of the cabinet. Protruding just slightly from the bottom edge of the door was the toe of a scuffed, brown leather dress shoe. She didn't confront him. She backed away from the bed, keeping her eyes fixed on that sliver of open wood. She stepped backward out the door, pulled it shut, and walked swiftly down the hall to the nurse's station. She grabbed the desk phone and dialed security. It took the guards 5 minutes to get off the elevator. They drew their batons and entered room 423. The wardrobe was empty. The window was locked from the inside. They checked the adjacent rooms. They checked the stairwells. The intruder had slipped away, navigating the maze of service corridors that ran behind the main wings. The administration dismissed it. They claimed a homeless man must have wandered in looking for a place to sleep and accidentally bumped the oxygen dial. They filed a generic incident report and told my mother to ensure the stairwell fire doors were latched. 2 weeks passed. The tension on the floor began to fade. Then the other nurse took a vacation, leaving my mom as the only nurse on the floor. She was doing her midnight rounds, checking IV drips. She walked into room 408. The bed was empty. The patient had passed away early that afternoon, and housekeeping hadn't yet arrived to strip the linens. Mom walked over to the small trash can near the sink to discard a used syringe wrapper. Resting on the porcelain edge of the sink was a small, spiral-bound notebook. It was cheap, the kind you buy at a drugstore. Mom picked it up, assuming a grieving family member had left it behind. She flipped the cardboard cover open to check for a name. There was no name, just columns of handwritten text. The handwriting was meticulous, written in dark blue ink. Mom read the first line. Room 410, Margaret, October 2nd. Labored breathing began at 1:14 a.m. Expiration at 1:42 a.m. Kept her eyes closed. She turned the page. Room 405. Justin, October 8th. Choking reflex at 2:03 a.m. Held his wrist. Pulse ceased at 2:19 a.m. Mom's fingers trembled. She flipped through dozens of pages. Every single entry documented the exact, minute-by-minute details of a patient dying on her ward. These weren't medical charts, these were observations. She turned to the very last entry. It was dated that exact day. Room 423, Charlie, still waiting. The blonde nurse is too attentive. Need to alter the schedule. My mother has blonde hair. She dropped the notebook on the floor. She walked straight to the locker room, grabbed her coat, and took the elevator to the lobby. She left her nursing clogs in her locker and walked out into the freezing Chicago wind in her stocking feet. She refused to step foot in that building ever again. The hospital security eventually handed the notebook over to the police. The detectives cross-referenced the dates in the journal with the ward's mortality logs. Every single time of death listed in that book matched the official hospital records perfectly. Whoever wrote those notes wasn't just guessing. He was in the room, standing in the shadows, hiding behind curtains or inside wooden wardrobes, watching these people take their final breaths. My mother spent the rest of her career working at a busy pediatric clinic during daylight hours. She told me the scariest part wasn't the notebook itself. It was the realization that in an enormous, echoing building full of dying people, nobody notices one extra shadow in the corner of the room. I started my career at a sprawling, underfunded rehabilitation center in rural area. The facility was designed to transition patients from intensive care back into their homes. We handled stroke victims, severe car crash recoveries, and complex post-op cases. You settle into a particular cadence when you work a floor like that. You learn the baseline vitals of your patients. You know who sleeps through the night, who gets agitated at sundown, and who needs extra pain management. When that rhythm breaks, your instincts scream at you. I was working the night rotation with a charge nurse named Lydia. She was a veteran, 20 years on the job, always calm, highly efficient. The newer girls practically worshipped her. She knew every attending physician's quirks and could insert a tricky IV on the first try. But about 3 months into my employment, I noticed a subtle, terrifying pattern. Patients under Lydia's direct care were declining, not rapidly, just fading. A man recovering from a shattered pelvis would suddenly become entirely unresponsive for 12 hours. An elderly woman who was otherwise doing well in physical therapy would suddenly develop unexplained bradycardia, a dangerously low heart rate in the middle of the night. I checked the charts. Everything Lydia documented was flawless. The dosage amounts matched the doctor's orders perfectly. Then came Mr. Henderson. He was a 50-year-old construction worker recovering from a severe spinal fusion. He was doing great, scheduled to be discharged on Friday. Wednesday night, I was sitting in the break room, eating a stale sandwich. Lydia walked in, grabbed a fresh saline flush from the supply closet, and mentioned she was going to check Henderson's catheter. 10 minutes later, the telemetry monitor at the central desk started chiming. I jogged out of the break room. Henderson's heart rate was plummeting. I rushed into his room. Lydia was already there, calmly adjusting his blankets. Henderson was pale, his eyes rolled back, his jaw slack. He looked heavily sedated. "What happened?" I asked, checking his pulse. It was thready and weak. "Just a sudden drop," Lydia replied, her tone conversational. "I already pushed a counteragent. He's stabilizing." I glanced at the IV pole. The clear plastic tubing leading into Henderson's arm had a small, rubber injection port. Sitting in the biohazard bin, right next to the bed, was an empty syringe. I didn't say anything. I helped her monitor him until his vitals leveled out, but the knot in my gut twisted tighter. The next night, I arrived for my shift 30 minutes early. I needed to verify my suspicions. The medication room was a small, windowless space secured by a numeric keypad. Inside was a large, automated dispensing cabinet called a Pyxis machine. You punch in your employee ID, select the patient, and the drawer pops open with the exact dosage required. The system tracks every single pill and vial. It's supposed to be foolproof. I logged in and pulled up Lydia's dispensing history for the past week. The screen populated with her withdrawals. Everything looked normal. Tylenol, standard antibiotics, mild blood thinners. Then I noticed the overrides. The system allows a nurse to pull emergency medication without a doctor's immediate digital approval, provided they document it later. Lydia had pulled large quantities of lorazepam and liquid fentanyl. But she hadn't documented them. She hadn't logged them into any patient's chart. I printed the list. I folded the paper, shoved it into my scrub pocket, and walked out into the corridor. Lydia was standing at the medication cart near the nurse's station, sorting small plastic cups. I approached her, my mouth felt dry. I wasn't a seasoned detective. I was a 23-year-old recent grad confronting a veteran. "Lydia," I said, keeping my voice low so the orderly down the hall couldn't hear. I checked the Pyxis logs, the emergency overrides. The math doesn't add up. She stopped sorting the cups. She didn't flinch. She slowly turned her head and looked at me. Her expression was completely devoid of emotion. "You're snooping in the logs," she stated, her voice smooth. Where is the fentanyl? I pushed, pulling the folded paper from my pocket. You pulled 3 vials last night. Henderson isn't prescribed that. Nobody on this wing is. Lydia set the plastic cup down. She leaned closer to me. The fluorescent lights overhead buzzed quietly. These people are suffering, she whispered, her eyes locked onto mine, unblinking. The doctors keep them alive just long enough to drain their insurance. They push them through physical therapy they can't handle. It's cruel. I give them peace, she continued, her tone shifting to something almost maternal. Just a little extra rest, a deep sleep. The system doesn't know how to care for them, but I do. Horror washed over me. She wasn't stealing the drugs to sell them. She wasn't an addict. She was actively inducing overdoses, playing God in a sterile hospital hallway. I'm calling the director of nursing, I said, stepping backward. Lydia smiled. It was a terrifying, hollow expression. Go ahead, she replied, gesturing toward the desk phone. I've worked here for 2 decades. The administration trusts me. My charting is impeccable. You are a new hire, barely off probation, who just illegally accessed my digital records without authorization. Who do you think they will believe? She walked past me, heading down the hall toward a patient's room, her rubber clogs squeaking softly against the floor. I didn't call the director. I bypassed the hospital hierarchy entirely. I walked out to the parking lot, got into my car, and drove directly to the local police precinct. I handed the printed logs to a desk sergeant and demanded to speak with a detective. The ensuing investigation tore the facility apart. The police secured a warrant for the Pyxis machine data. They exhumed 2 bodies. The toxicology reports came back saturated with unauthorized sedatives. Lydia was arrested 3 weeks later in her driveway. She didn't resist. There was no panic, no protest, only a stillness that made the moment feel heavier than it should have been. During the trial, the defense tried to paint her as a compassionate caregiver suffering from burnout. The jury didn't buy it, but I didn't follow the case to the end. I still don't want to know the final outcome or how many years she actually got. I just wanted to leave it behind me. I packed up my apartment, moved to a different town, and hoped for a fresh start. I'm still practicing nursing. I work at a decent hospital now, but to this day, I can't look at a hospital bed without wondering who might be standing over it while the patient sleeps. People assume the greatest danger in a medical facility is a superbug or a surgical error. They forget that the person pushing the medicine through your IV line has absolute, unchecked control over your life, and sometimes their definition of care is fatal.